Hey everybody, Professor Snart just checking in as we move into Unit 3 in our online Brit-Lit course. So we have just finished up Unit 2, which had us looking at Milton and Paradise Lost. And like I suggested a couple of places, Milton doesn't in Paradise Lost. They don't fit into the time frame of our course, so we're kind of cheating on the earlier side. But the reason we do so is that Milton and Paradise Lost in particular, and Satan in particular in Paradise Lost, had such an enormous influence on later writers, particularly the Romantics, which is where we're getting to, and really where our course begins, the sort of 1800 and moving on from there. Milton's Paradise Lost had such a profound influence on those poets. I think it's really useful to pay attention to Milton. Because of that, it's often expressed that he was this sort of towering author figure who cast a shadow so far into the literary future, pardon me, that it's still really with us today, although maybe not as obvious, or references to ideas that Milton either developed or kind of explored in ways that hadn't been explored before. The particular reference might not be to Milton, but that idea stems directly from his work, usually from Paradise Lost, which is kind of his major epic for his lifetime. So in terms of like what we want to take away from Milton, ultimately it's this question of one's ability to challenge authority. So for Milton, this notion of aspiring beyond where one is at is a form of hubris, or of being prideful. So when Satan challenges, or Lucifer I should say, which is his name before he falls out of heaven, when he challenges in heaven, God is the sort of supreme, top dude, that for Milton is a breach of his proper place in the hierarchy. So even though later readers see Milton as sort of sympathy for the devil, if you want to say it, that's a misreading of Milton. Milton simply didn't believe that. Maybe subconsciously you could make arguments, but we won't get into that. So Milton did not see Lucifer or Satan as the hero of the poem. In fact, when we read, particularly early on in Paradise Lost, when we read Lucifer newly fallen from heaven and they're down in hell and things are looking pretty drastic, he's presented in fairly heroic terms. He rallies the troops, he makes this great speech, he volunteers for this mission. He's like the movie star, right? He does all the things that we would expect a hero to do, but they're always motivated by self-interest, which is fundamentally the problem with everything that Satan ends up doing. It's always sort of prideful, jealous self-interest that motivates what he does. So his challenging of authority was absolutely not, in the long run, heroic as far as Milton was concerned. And in fact, when he is painted as heroic, that's Milton's little, fairly clever way of, in this long poem that's ultimately about how people are tempted, when Milton, or when, I always make that mistake, when Satan is presented in these heroic terms and we're tempted to see him as heroic, that's Milton playing a little joke on us, showing us how easy it is to be tempted, to believe in someone who's a great speaker and who's energetic and who's like positive can-do attitude. We fall into that trap, which is precisely what Milton imagined his readers what we would do. If you do get a chance to read the entirety of Paradise Lost, what you'll see is that as the poem progresses, Milton becomes, or again, Satan becomes much less and less the heroic character. So it's quite clear by the end of it that he's not the leader, the inspirational figure that he's presented as early on. In fact, it's kind of funny in terms of the big scope of the poem. Satan actually literally goes from heaven, he falls there, he becomes smaller. Eventually, he turns into all of these various figures like a cormorant, which is a bird. So he's up in a tree, and then he turns into a toad, so he's down on the ground, and then he's a snake, he gets even lower, and then he's a mist, he loses his bodily form entirely. It's like he sort of devolves literally throughout the poem, but also metaphorically as well. Okay, we can sort of ignore all of that as the reading that Milton would have understood or believed in. And what we're concerned with is then the misreading of Milton and of Paradise Lost and of that Satan or Lucifer character by later romantics who really saw in that figure precisely the sort of rebellious spirit, that energy against tyranny that those authors, the Romantic period authors, were experiencing in their own political and social context in terms of revolutionary efforts to throw off tyrannical governments, for example. They saw it in the French Revolution, the earlier American Revolution, certainly efforts for democratic reform in England itself. So there were a lot of poets and writers and readers who really saw in Milton's Paradise Lost an exploration of how one aspires beyond kind of one's station in life. How do you go beyond that? For Milton, right, that was sort of a breach of etiquette. It was a breach of that great chain of being and how everything has its place. God's at the top. There's this whole string of angels. Then there's man, gendered man, woman, animals, etc., 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 and on down the line. You know, that notion really became problematic, gosh, in Milton's own time, obviously, but certainly in an era like the Romantic period where people were hungry for more political power, more political voice, more democratic freedoms. That struggle is still with us today, and why Paradise Lost can still be misread in terms of, especially early on, this energetic, heroic, aspiring figure. He happens to be Satan, but oh well, who really does come off as like the hero of the poem. So beyond even that, Milton provides us again with this really intricate exploration of fundamental questions that would be picked up by Romantic era poets. Questions of free will, of free choice, of self-determination, all of those kinds of things. So Milton and Paradise Lost is just this kind of massive influence on the writers that we'll begin to study, that it's really worth our time to go backwards a little bit and pay attention to Milton and Paradise Lost. So we move on from there then and get into Thomas Gray now, who is not a prototypical Romantic poet. He's just sort of a pre-Romantic, but again, as with Milton, he's closer in time to the that sort of 1800 time marker that we're interested in. But he presents, again, some of the early inclinations that would be picked up by so many authors in the Romantic period. So Thomas Gray and his elegy written in a country churchyard provides us with a good example of sort of two aspects that would be interesting for the Romantics. The one is just the interest in the pastoral or the non-urban scene. So sort of that country life, and relatedly, an interest in something other than the noble, heroic action of epic poetry. So the question of, could poetry be written about the poor, about the uneducated, about the sort of marginalized figures, the sick, the disenfranchised, those who didn't aspire to be great, heroic, noble, sort of kingly leaders of men? Is it possible to write poetry that celebrates that without just denigrating it or ignoring it entirely? So that impulse that Gray felt to pay attention to those things, and this is the same guy who wrote poems about his cat, about his goldfish, so he really was, in many ways, kind of a modern poet in the sense that he didn't always fall into, poetry has to be about these enormous universal ideals. It can be about everyday life, about what everyday people experience in their everyday world. So Gray isn't obviously as accessible or sort of banal and everyday as truly contemporary poets are, but you'll see when you read his work, there's that impulse. He still sort of does deal with bigger kind of universal general ideas, but there's still that impulse to pay attention to things that hadn't been really paid attention to before. And also his poetic style is distant from us for our kind of reading ear, but is a much more accessible, less intricate and artificial kind of rigged up poetry than a lot of that neoclassical style that had come before him. So we have to understand that in its historical context, because you read it now and it feels very maybe stilted, or the sentences, the word order in the sentences isn't natural speech for us, but it's actually much closer to a natural form of language than what had preceded writers like Gray. And again, this is something that the Romantics will pick up. Somebody like Wordsworth will go on to argue that poetry ultimately needs to be the language of men speaking to men. He meant humanity, but he used the gendered term. So again, that sort of natural, more conversational style of language. Even with someone like Wordsworth, you read it now, and it's not conversational in the way that we might be used to. But if you compare it with Paradise Lost, or really with kind of the interim poets between Milton and then the Romantics, which is a very artificial period that poetry enters, his work is like Chatty Cathy all of a sudden. And that's part of what we'll talk about or look at in Unit 3 in terms of Romanticism as a reaction against the sort of artifice of the neoclassical style and neoclassical period. Okay, so that's lots to think about, and sort of gives us a little context for Milton, and also gets us moving in that direction of the Romantic poets, as in many ways, you know, formulating a reaction against what had come before it, and also picking up those strains that they felt were important from that kind of monumental work of Milton's in Paradise Lost. All right, so I'll let you get to it. As always, if you have any questions, be sure to be in touch, and I'll check in with everybody pretty soon.